I have been looking forward to this conversation for a few reasons. One is we have the Cambridge event that we're collaborating on next week, and I'm very excited for you to present to the whole community. Even over the last 3 or 4 months, it's been cool for me because I didn't know much about the Korean diaspora, and I didn't realize that there were already people within the space working on their own projects that have been very successful. So maybe just as a starting point, could you share a little bit of background on who you are and some of the projects that you've worked on?
Sure. Joseph Juhn, I recently relocated to Korea with my wife 4 months ago. Prior to that, I was living in New York City for 12 years and upstate New York for 3 years. I was born in Minneapolis and came to Korea when I was 5 years old and stayed here until 17 years old, right?
Okay.
So early part of my identity formation took place in Korea. I think the identity crisis began when I went back to the States at 18. I tried to figure out what it meant to be a Korean American at the same time. And it wasn't until college, fourth year, second year, when I went to this thing called CASCON. I don't know if you ever heard of it.
I haven't.
It's a synonym for Korean American Students Conference. It was pretty big back in the day, where it was an annual conference that started in Princeton in 1987. And annually, hundreds, if not thousands, of Korean Americans from all different states gathered in one academic institution, say Princeton, Harvard, Stanford, UCSD in my year, and they talked about, issues and topics ranging from, what it means to be Korean, Korean American, the U.S.-Korea relations, North Korean human rights issues, LA riots, and what does that mean for us, political empowerment, Asian American representation, and so forth. It's a 4-day conference, right? And I ended up going to one of them, and in my second year, it took place in UW in Seattle. And I happened to walk into a seminar led by this legendary Korean American journalist by the name of K.W. Lee, who talked about the importance of 1992 LA uprising / riots, and how that played a pivotal role in sort of cementing and solidifying the Korean American identity. And for me, that was sort of a game changer, right? And if I were to define my identity from before and after, I think that would have been one of the first pivotal moments where I felt like, I don't have to juggle between this Korean or American identity. I can actually be both. And this is a term that, the phrase that he coined, K.W. Lee, he said, before 1992, Koreans were just immigrants. We're living as Korean immigrants. But after 1992, we became Korean Americans, right? So this idea of being an ethnic minority in the States and having a responsibility, not just only to amongst ourselves, but to the larger society as a whole, sort of gave me a new eye to understanding and internalizing what it means to be a Korean American, right? And I thought that was the end of it. I thought that was the end of my identity journey. But when I graduated from college, I went to China to live there for about 6 months. My first job happened to be at what's called UST, Yanbian University of Science and Technology. So it requires a lot of explaining, but I'll make it quick. 1992, a Korean American missionary went to China and basically established the school from ground zero. Thinking that he wants to provide good, proper education to Korean ethnic Chinese students, right? So when I went in 2007, I had a friend who was a third-generation Korean ethnic Chinese, Joseonjok, and one day he pulled me over and he said, "Hey, have you heard of this fruit called apple pear?" Right? I'm like, "What's apple pear?" And he says, "It's the type of fruit that's only produced in our region, basically a hybrid between apple and pear, right?" And then he goes on to say, "Hey, we Korean ethnic Chinese people have traditionally compared ourselves to this fruit because we're neither fully apple nor fully pear." Right? So the reason I'm going at length to explain this episode is because that was a moment when I was like, holy crap, this whole idea of dual or multi-identity crisis is not something that you and I, Korean Americans, go through, or any ethnic minorities go through in the States. But any Korean who by virtue of living overseas, at one point, struggle with their identity has to go through this kind of stage, right? Identity crisis stage. And so from that point on, I traveled to and lived in many different places via internship, like volunteer or short-term mission trips from church. I always ran into Koreans in Germany, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil.
And was that intentionally so, or just serendipitously, or a combination?
Both. Sometimes I sought out for a Korean community, and other times I just ran into them, right, by chance. And so this type of experiences accumulated over time, and I started wondering what it means to be not just a Korean or a Korean American, but a member of the larger Korean diaspora, right? But I guess I needed a more dramatic and transformative moment for me to really act upon this curiosity. And that was in 2015 when I went to Cuba just for fun, just backpacking. And then my taxi driver outside of the airport happened to be a fourth generation Korean Cuban. And I'm like, okay, if there's God, I think he's sending me a signal right now. And from then on, what was initially intended to be a 20-minute YouTube clip going back to Cuba and just documenting their lives that I wanted to upload onto YouTube turned out to be a full-time 3-year whole filmmaking journey. And so that was my first film, Jeronimo. I stopped practicing law. I was a lawyer for 5 years. And then I thought I was going to go back to practicing just because I haven't met anyone who made money out of documentary.
Yes.
But COVID hit, and then I started wondering what I should do next. And it was just a few months before the 2020 presidential election when I realized that there are 5 Korean Americans running for U.S. Congress. And I thought, maybe I should start following them, right? So that was my second film. And in between, I wrote a book, an essay published by a Korean publisher on my sort of diasporic journey, uncovering the lives of different types of people who identify themselves as to be Korean. And now, I moved to Korea for potentially another project involving some Korean American missionaries and doctors who have been treating kids with developmental disabilities in North Korea for the past 10 years or so until they got kicked out during COVID. And now they're planning to slowly, gradually, resettle back into North Korea.
Wow.
And I've been wanting to sort of follow their journey and footsteps. And so that's one of the main incentives for my relocation to Korea. Yeah, so that's where I'm at.
On Geronimo and Chosen, I have a handful of questions on each of those.
Sure.
But even before that, when you had mentioned your upbringing, was it age 5, did you say you came to Korea?
Yeah.
It's interesting for me because you, at least at a high level, kind of identify as Korean American, right?
Sure.
But that comes in all different spectrums.
Sure.
In terms of your upbringing in Korea from age 5 until like 17, it's funny because I come across some people, even in Korea, who are ethnically not Korean, but they've been spending, 10, 15 years here, and they speak the language fluently.
Sure.
And when they go to their like home country, they actually feel a lot more out of place,
Sure.
and they feel more at home in Korea. So for yourself, in terms of your upbringing, your friend group growing up in Korea, I guess, was it more so like Korean influenced, or was it more so US influenced in some way?
Yeah, it was absolutely Korean influence, right? So I guess the only time where I started differentiating sort of my background compared to other peers was I went to the States when I was 5th grade and I lived there for a year. This was when my dad was doing a sabbatical in California. And so I got to spend a year in elementary, and I guess I picked up some English at the time. And once I came back, but my friends group still remained intact, right? I guess I spoke some English, but I went to regular, just Korean education system, right? So I did 중학교 and part of 고1, the 9th grade in Korea. And I had no desire to return to the States. I mean, I was just an average, high schooler, right? I didn't know anything better. It's not like I had high aspirations. But by virtue of having born in the States, I had dual citizenship, right? And by Korean law, right? If you don't decide one citizenship over the other, and if you end up keeping both, you have to serve in the military, right? So my dad, one day, this is when I was ninth grade, going to Korean school, whatever. He's like, hey, you have to decide in 2 years which citizenship you want to retain, right? And then he suggested that I watch Dead Poets Society. I don't know if you ever came across that film. So it's sort of a signature film when it comes to like a coming of age, right? And Mr. Kitting is the name of the main character, played by Robin Williams. Shares this famous phrase of carpe diem, right? Seize the day, right? Make your lives extraordinary. And he's a prep school teacher, right? In a expensive boarding school. This is back in like 1960s, at least the setup, right? The background of the film is. And I identify myself with the expensive boarding school students, right? And it's not just me, any Korean, just average, regular Korean, right? Whoever that watched Dead Poets Society often turns out to be like, oh, this is my favorite film of all time, because of such a rigorous education system that really, I believe, kills the humanity of our personal character, all in the name of getting into top colleges, right? The sky, right? The mission.
Yep.
And so I disliked Korean education system like all of my peers. But when I watched that movie, I think something in me sparked, and I was like, if I go to the States, maybe there are more opportunities where I can do carpe diem, right? And so I said, hey, okay, Dad, I want to go to the States. And then I transferred to international school for a couple of years. It's called ICS, International Christian School. And just a few months before I was to, get on the flight to go to the States, something happened in Korea, and I think this is super interesting. Do you know this singer named Yoo Seung-jun? Steve Yoo? No. So he was kind of like a Michael Jackson-esque Korean singer in the late 90s and early 2000s. Okay. And he had a sort of U.S. green card, right? He's one of the Kyopo singers. And then he became probably one of the most celebrated celebrities at the time. And then any programs that he would go out to interview, he said, I'm going to serve in the Korean military, right? Although I don't have to because I'm a green card holder. He claimed that he's going to be a good Korean citizen and serve in the military. He ended up not doing that and ended up going back to the States one day, just out of a sudden decision. And that created a huge uproar, right, across the country. And he became the most hated man, probably in modern Korean history, right? To this day, he's banned from entering Korea, right? I think this is a great, human rights violations. If you're a serial killer, you're brought back to Korea and tried and served in due time, right? But he's still banned from entering the Korea. That's how much people had issues with him, beef with him. And this happened just a few months before I went back to the States, right? So I think something clicked in me where I felt like if you don't serve in the military in Korea, you cannot be a valid Korean male. And I think this is what triggered my wanting to become more Americanized once I went back to the States.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting. And so before that kind of period or realization, you would have maybe identified as I'm just Korean?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
The other piece of your background that I'm quite interested in is just the, I guess, life transition of being a lawyer or pursuing that kind of career path, and then becoming a documentary / filmmaker. Your early experiences, because I know you did study film in undergrad.
That's right.
Can you tell me a little bit about your own interests or curiosities in film in general, and what your initial career aspirations were when you decided to go to law school? I'm really not educated well when it comes to films and movies. Mostly I prefer podcasts and books, but I'm still quite fascinated about this whole career transition for you.
Yeah, so I am one of what people might call a very cause-driven person, not a career-driven person. So I went to college undecided. I didn't decide a major, right? And the first elective course that I ended up taking was this thing called History of Cinema, right? And walking out of that class, I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to major in film, right? And it has a lot to do with the professor who taught that class. His name is J.P. Gorin. He's a legendary figure in the Nouvelle Vague, French New Wave in the 60s. And he came over to UCSD and taught there as a professor. He was just extremely charismatic. And I was completely just mesmerized by his charisma and sense of direction in life. So I ended up majoring in film. I mean, it was that simple. But my film school, UC San Diego, wasn't a big production school. It was bigger on theory. So I ended up writing a lot of papers, and I only made just a few, student films, right? And I never took that route that seriously because I thought I was just studying hard. But something happened in college where I got exposed to a lot of social issues around me, especially surrounding the 1992 LA riots. I mean, I was too young to know what it meant. And when the LA riots took place, I was still in Korea. I was only 8 years old. But when I came back and learned of that event and how much Korean Americans still lacked representation, we didn't have that much of a say when it comes to political decision making. I got super involved with the Korean American Students Conference as well as the Student Association at UC San Diego. And little by little, I think I knew maybe going into my third year that I wanted to go to law school because my intention of wanting to study film and actually law is exactly the same. I wanted to participate in a cause-driven sort of life. And for documentary, it was, you can maybe, hopefully, get the audience engaged and make, no matter how small, some change in the society through behind the camera. Whereas going to law and making I don't know, defending plaintiffs or whatever it may be, or just participating in the lawmaking process, I felt like I can wield that bigger sort of impact. So that's what initially led me to law school. Needless to say, extremely naive. I don't think I saw anyone in my class who wanted to just come to law school purely for naive reasons, but I certainly was. And so I concentrated on the human rights law, disabilities law, the disability rights law, international law, and national security law. That's what I was all concentrated on. And coming out of law school, I thought I was going to be a human rights lawyer, but it didn't pan out that way. So I ended up working at a Korean government agency in Manhattan, handling intellectual property issues and doing a lot of startup initiatives. At the time, there were a lot of Korean Americans and Koreans coming to New York to set up their entrepreneurship or startups. So I was sort of creating the Korean ecosystem, startup ecosystem, right? So that's what I was doing for 4 years. And going to Cuba, I mean, I didn't initially think that I was going to switch career. I thought, if anything, it's going to be 1 year sabbatical year. I focused on creating this craft. But, life never pans out the way you wanted it to. So when I wanted to come back, I felt like I was too late. And besides, COVID hit, so no one was really hiring. And then I just fell into, another opportunity of creating the second documentary. So that's what kept me going until now. To this day, I never made that conscious decision of, hey, I'm going to live as a documentary filmmaker from now on. It just happened this way, and I'm sticking with it for now. Yeah.
When you were saying that you were more so a cause-driven person than a career-driven person,
Sure.
If I understand correctly, your younger brother is also a human rights lawyer or human activist lawyer, right?
Yes.
Is this something that was influenced by your parents or your upbringing, at least for you, or was it something that grew on you over time? Like, did you have different career ambitions when you were a younger kid, like in your early teens, late teens?
I wouldn't think so. I don't want to give my parents too much credit. Although I do give them credit when it comes to, they weren't like a pushy tiger parents type. They always respected what me and my younger brother wanted to do, whether it was filmmaking or lawyering, whatever it may be. My younger brother even ended up going to China to study Eastern philosophy for a couple of years, and they fully endorsed that, pathway too. So my parents are very flexible when it comes to, hey, all it matters is what you want to do, and as long as you do it with the right intention and right integrity, you have our blessings, right? So in that sense, I'm very lucky to have them as my parents. But I think it was heavily influenced by my Korean American friends back in high school as well as in college. I ended up going to a high school in Claremont, that's where Claremont colleges are in Southern California. And I was very lucky that I met Korean American friends who were like poets, right? And they're like mostly PKs, right? Pastors' kids, but they had quite a special traits. They were writers or singers, and they don't want to. I don't know how familiar you're with the Southern California sort of Orange County.
Not too familiar. I mean, I've interacted with a few like Bay Area Koreans, but most of those were startup founders, either Korean Americans or like Koreans that came to the Bay Area to try and like make it in Silicon Valley. But I haven't spent much time in LA area.
The point I was trying to make was my group of Korean American Claremont boys is what I call, were nothing like the OC kids or the LA kids, right? They were their own breed basically, and they are the ones who asked me some of the most unthought of questions, right? Like I think one of the first questions David asked me was like, "Hey, what do you think of a U.S. prison system?" Right? And I was just like a fresh off the boat, right? A Korean student who only cared for like exams and whatnot. I'm like, I never thought of it. And they're the ones who started questioning, hey, what does it mean to have a Christian faith? What does it mean to have a personal salvation but not care for the poor, or not be involved in the societal issues? So I think they trigger me to sort of have a larger, expanded worldview when it comes to that. Wow. So I give them most of my tribute and credit, if anything, right? But it wasn't a byproduct of my parents' sort of guidance or the Korean system. No, not at all. Yeah.
When I seek out like English-speaking people here to have conversation with, because I don't speak Korean, most of them are other like Korean diaspora types of backgrounds that have come back to Seoul. But there is also a handful of people that are Korean born and raised.
I see.
They speak a little bit of English, maybe because they spent some time abroad. And unfortunately, a lot of them want to leave the country to pursue other economic opportunities. They want to leave Korea.
I see.
Right? And I think sometimes it makes sense when I talk to them and I ask them about their issues at work or the school systems that they're in that they want to get away from. But the interesting thing is a lot of them still feel some like responsibility or obligation to like give back to Korea and the country in some way. And for you, when you left Korea and you were living in the States, I mean, your first like real job was in Manhattan and you were working for a Korea affiliated organization. In terms of your like life goals or your own like cause ambitions, was the Korea piece of it always going to be a key piece for you? I'm curious, like, maybe you could have just done kind of cause-driven types of work outside of the, let's say, Korea ecosystem.
Sure.
But did you also feel some sort of like responsibility as well?
Definitely towards Koreans or Korean Americans or the Korean American community that I was part of, but not necessarily towards the country, right, or the institution. That was never my sort of pull. But I was very involved with the Korean American community that I was part of in New York City in various capacity, whether in like civic empowerment, form, or various policy making or educational or the Korean language school aspect of things. I thought it was, that's why I went to law school to begin with, right? That's why I wanted to make films to begin with, to highlight the lives of the diaspora, right? And I understand what you mean by some of your Korean peers wanting to leave the country, but maybe this is related, maybe it's not, but like I do a lot of like speaking here and there, and one of the questions that I received in the past was, what do I think about what I think is different between an expat and a diaspora. I thought this was an interesting question, so I gave it a hard thought. And I don't know if it's the right definition, but at least to me, expat is less committed to the place in which the person lives, whereas diaspora has a full, like, vested commitment and an interest to the environment, right? So, I don't regard being a member of diaspora as a privilege. If anything, I think it's more like a responsibility, because diaspora never occupies the mainstream or dominant group. Generally speaking, they're always on the periphery and the margins, right? So, like, whatever I do has not much to do with power or money or influence, but it's more, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be too self-deprecating, but I think it has a lot to do with more of like interest in humanity, if I can put it without sounding pretentious, right? Yeah.
With the Geronimo, that project and your trip to Cuba, before you went to Cuba, did you even know that there were Koreans that existed in Cuba?
I had no idea. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
But you did know about like the Korean Brazilian community, or even some Koreans in Argentina?
Sure. I lived in Brazil for 3 months. I was doing internship there during my law school year. And then I didn't realize at first, but soon after I got there, I realized that there are 50,000 plus Korean Brazilians, right, that migrated back in 60s. So I got exposed to the South American Korean population in various different parts of South America. But never did I imagine that I would run into Korean in Cuba, right? Because that was supposed to be like a fun trip, right? Sort of like self-patting, like end of the year rewarding sort of trip. But the nature of the trip quickly changed once I got into that cab. I'm like, okay, like it's gonna turn out to be something entirely different, and it certainly did. Yeah.
And were you like on a quest for some sort of an adventure when you went to Cuba? Like, you had like brought your GoPro around,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so you were filming some of this. And maybe if you didn't meet that first cab driver when you were there, it would have all been more like touristy types of content.
Yeah.
But you were trying to capture some sort of moments at the time, right?
Yeah, I guess I had some basic surface level knowledge of Cuba. But just like any other dumb, like American tourist, right? You want to just get on a 60s Ford, like retro car. You want to go check out like Che's museum, Che Guevara's museum. But that was the extent to which I knew about Cuba, or that I felt like Cuba had anything else to offer, right? I just wanted to smoke cigar, like natural cigar, and like drink rum and just be stupid, right? Just walk on Malecon, which is the signature like landmark, right? So, I borrowed GoPro from my roommate, and in the film I misstated as if I bought GoPro, but I ended up borrowing it from my roommate just because I thought I was gonna do like a travel blog, if anything. But yeah, I think to this day, if I didn't have a GoPro, even if I had met a Korean Cuban taxi driver, I don't think I had enough of courage to make this film, turn this into film, because the encounter itself was very dramatic and very serendipitous, and the fact that I capture that first moment of encounter, I'm like, this has to be used in a professional manner, right? I can't just put it up on YouTube and say, hey, guys, I had a cool experience. So I think, I'm grateful that I had GoPro at the time,
The first, that cab driver who you first came into contact with, was she one of the descendants of Geronimo? Okay.
She was a daughter. She was the only daughter of Geronimo.
And I imagine some people that are listening to this conversation will have heard of it. But for those who don't, in terms of who Geronimo was, could you explain a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the first conversations that I had with the cab driver, I'm like, you look Asian, are you Chinese? And she says, no, I'm 4th generation Korean Cuban, right? I'm like, really? Like, how did you even end up here, right? How did your grandpa even come here? And she says, My grandpa came here 100 years ago as a slave who ended up cutting cactuses. Anaking is what they call it. And my father fought in the Cuban Revolution and was friends with Che Guevara and worked with Fidel Castro. And I said, wait, are you saying your grandpa was a slave turned Korean independent fighter and your father was a Cuban revolutionary? And you're driving this cab, you know, like transporting me from one place to another? That's too good to be true. As someone who studied film, I'm like, you know, and I always had a heart for documentaries, not fiction. So I'm like, if I don't turn this into anything, what a waste this is going to be, right? And so I went back 5 more times over the span of 3 years and shot, 300 hours of footage, not just in Cuba, but also in the States, Canada, and Korea. I try to identify everyone who came, who crossed paths with Jeronimo. Jeronimo is a revolutionary, right? And he turned that into a 90-minute documentary, and it's called Jeronimo, named after the Korean Cuban revolutionary. And but the film has 2 interesting parts. One is I focus large on their immigration story and how Jeronimo became a Cuban revolutionary. But the latter half of the film focuses on how Jeronimo, despite all of his dedication to building an idealistic socialist country in Cuba, when the Soviet Union disintegrated and North Korea and Cuba became extremely poor as a result, he gets invited to South Korea on the 50th anniversary of the Korean Liberation Day. And then he becomes a renewed man, right? He becomes a changed man. He finds a new purpose in life, which was to sort of reconstruct the Korean Cuban identity and Korean Cuban community. So he goes back and dedicates the rest of his life doing just that, right? And so, you know, I don't know about you, Tiger, but growing up in the States or in Korea, I always look for a role model who appear to have internalized both sides of identity in a very healthy, constructive way. But I was never able to really do that. Everyone seems to have tilted towards one way or the other. They're either more Americanized or they're more Koreanized, right? So having that perfect balance of healthy, constructive appreciation of both cultures, I don't think I've identified too many of my friends of being so. And when I heard of Jeronimo, I felt like he's someone who's done that. And so I wanted to understand why he wanted to, even after having been born in Cuba and became one of the highest government officials in the Castro government. I mean, he was bleeding Cuban, right? But then he wanted to reconstruct and reconnect with his Korean roots. And I wanted to understand that psychology. That's why I think to me, he was like a mythical, sort of very respectable figure where I had to decouple to understand what was his motivation was, right? So, yeah.
The most of the production for that documentary, this was 2015-16 timeframe?
Yeah, this was, it began in 2016, right? My filming journey, and it ended in 2019. It had a theatrical release in Korea on the same day as Frozen 2. So we didn't do too well in terms of box office, but it sort of, it triggered a discourse on Koreans living overseas and what does that mean, right? I mean, I used to compare like Koreans a lot to the Jewish diaspora example, just because that's the best known, that's the most prevalently acknowledged form of diaspora. But I'm more careful these days because of what's happening in Israel and how their diasporic identity is something that I once looked up to now turned into a more nationalistic, sort of ethnocentric sort of endeavor. But no one really talks in Korea about what kind of relationship they should have with the members of diaspora. I mean, we have freaking 8 million Koreans living outside of Korea, and we're not even counting North Korea. That's another 25 million, right? So 33 million Koreans live outside of South Korea. and we don't know too much about them. I think it's about time that we began that discourse in a different spectrum of the society, right? Whether educationally, policy making, politics, society-wise. I don't think that discourse is being had enough. Yeah.
With the that whole Geronimo journey, like one of the things that to me made it quite special is that he had kind of this like legendary status, and he wasn't actually in the documentary aside from historical artifacts and other people talking about him.
That's right.
When did he pass?
He passed 2006.
2006.
So this was roughly 10 years before I set my foot in Cuba. Yeah.
And what do you think? Do you think that if he was still alive and you had made this documentary, do you think it's better that the fact that he has passed, or do you think it could have been even more interesting if he was there? This is all purely hypothetical.
Sure, of course. There's a similar documentary that I kind of benchmarked after. It's called Searching for Sugar Man. I don't know if you heard of this documentary. It won like huge Sundance awards, and it was a big it's one of the better known documentaries out there. And the basic premise of that movie is this, right? There's this nameless singer somewhere in the Midwest in the States who's kind of like Bob Dylan-esque, but wasn't as popular, nowhere near the level of any popular singers in the States. He was Filipino, obviously he was an ethnic minority. He was a labor worker, right? Doing all the dirty works on the streets, but he still loved to sing. Somehow his album went around the world and landed in South Africa, and it became a huge national hit, right? So everyone in South Africa knew who this sugar man was, but no one in the States could care enough about him. So one day the filmmakers decided to pick up their camera and search for this sugar man, right? Quote unquote sugar man, not even knowing if he's still alive, right? So at the end of the film, they end up identifying this man named Sugar Man, right? Who's living in Miami or Ohio or something, Mississippi or Michigan or somewhere around there, who turned out to be a huge sort of letdown, right? He doesn't live up to the expectation and the whole fantasy mythical fantasy that they created. Nevertheless, he's alive and he talks, and yet maybe he's not in a fully functioning sort of capacity, mentally speaking. So, watching that, you have a lot of mixed emotions, right? On the one hand, you want to find who Sugar Man is, along with the directors. But once you detect him and identify who he is, you have this sort of bittersweet feeling about the weakness of humanity and the kind of things that we create in our minds doesn't always pan out to be the realistic version, right? So, but I don't know, for Geronimo, he was too legendary, right?
Yeah.
In fact, I didn't have enough time in the film to include all the great things that his peers had to say about Geronimo, not even really any bad memories, right? So, having all that said, I think if Geronimo is still alive and in a fully functioning state, I think I would have greatly enjoyed my conversation with him. In fact, I often dreamt about him, throughout making of this film, because I'm making a film about the person I never met. I can only rely on other people's witnesses or hearsay or their interviews. So I don't know. I think he would have never. I don't think he would have disappointed me still, but. Maybe it's better to stay as is. I don't know. Yeah.
With when you were doing, I guess, research or preparation, and even having some of the interviews with Geronimo's descendants, were you able to find any historical documents or anything online about Geronimo that was citing him? Because I'm just curious from, if you hadn't made this documentary, if his story kind of would have just evaporated in the background and maybe nobody would have known about him. But whether it's like Korean American or I guess like Korean Latin American types of historians, were they familiar with Geronimo as a figure?
I didn't see much of academic records on Geronimo, but I can't give myself exclusive credit for uncovering this man because, KBS, NBC, some of the reporters have visited Cuba in the early 2000s and have interviewed Jeronimo at some point. So I was able to use some of those archive footage.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, I think the South Korean government made an effort in the early 2000s to come and do a research on the Korean Cubans. Right. So I had to rely, primarily on those existing documents. Yeah.
And then in terms of the impact, both for the Koreans in Cuba, I'm just curious in terms of, have you been able to keep in touch with most of those relationships?
Sure.
And do you still hear, I guess, what has come out of this effort? Are there specific things that happened after that maybe surprised you?
Yeah, and this is not, I'm not saying that I give myself credit for this, but South Korea normalized diplomatic relations with Cuba last year, actually on Valentine's Day of last year, 2024. So that was big news because prior to that, Cuba only had diplomatic relations with North Korea, right? And that was one of the main reasons as to why a lot of Korean tourists couldn't come here properly, right? They had, because there's no embassy in Cuba, essentially. It's difficult to say, mainly because the economic and social disturbance in Cuba is so severe right now. Even when I went in 2015 until 2019, a lot of Cubans were relatively free of worry from economic needs and whatnot. But now, since COVID, there is a huge political turmoil and economic people start witnessing starvation level poverty. And so a lot of Korean Cubans that I know are trying to leave Cuba, right? And so I've received several calls from my friends in Korean Cuban friends that they want to look for an opportunity to live in South Korea or the States, right? So hopefully, the movie made some impact. I actually, in fact, when I made Jeronimo to the fullest version, the first place where I screened the film was in Havana, Cuba, in front of the Jeronimo's family, right? And extended other Korean Cuban community. And it was very moving moment, right? I mean, well received. At some point, I don't think they took me seriously when I said, hey, I'm keep coming back to make a film about you guys. But after 3.5 years, I finally did so. And they're like, okay, after all, you aren't lying. I get DM messages every once in a while from some younger Korean Cuban descendants saying, hey, I didn't know much about my history, but thanks to your film, because the film gets circulated within the community members, I have a better understanding of what it is now. But Cuba is in a dire situation, right? So that's what worries me most at this point. And I hope for the, well-being of Korean Cuban friends down there.
After Geronimo was officially released, I would have thought that you would be getting inbound from other Korean diaspora communities potentially about hey, here's this interesting figure, maybe you should make a documentary about him. Did that kind of stuff happen? I mean, I know you ended up going and producing Chosen, which I want to ask you about. But in terms of just other things about Korean diaspora heritage and stories, were there new things that were popping up out of the blue?
Absolutely. I can't even count how many times I've been asked to produce a film about this particular character living in this particular country. But oftentimes, almost all of the times when anyone, suggests those ideas to me, they say without any serious sort of proposal or preparations or budget for it. If I had ample budget where I don't have to worry about, making ends meet, I would love to travel to Kazakhstan, make a film about Hong Bom-do, this military general, or travel to India, meet some Korean Indians who've been living there since the World War II, or go to this Fiji island and some other islands where there are some indigenous Koreans living there, right? Unfortunately, because I told you that I took filmmaking not as a sort of a career choice, but I was still very much cause-driven. I think even after many proposals or suggestions, I think at the end of the day, I had to be convinced and persuaded that this person is important enough for people to know and for me to really believe in. And so it never materialized. Although, ideally I would want to make members of Korean diaspora in all different parts of the world. Yeah.
With the second documentary chosen,
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of contrasting them, they couldn't really be more different.
Yeah.
In that, like with Geronimo, it was his family members and
Right.
people around him. He had already passed, so you were kind of telling the story in a retrospective point of view. You had one character kind of to focus on. I actually have not seen Chosen, but I just imagine in terms of even entering like the whole political landscape that it must have been disorienting. Like, can you tell me a little bit about how you decided to pursue that?
Sure. I think in order for me to talk about Chosen, I think we need to start from a book that I read during COVID. Actually, as I was saying, after Jeronimo, I wanted to go back to the States to look for a job, but COVID hit, and all my screening sort of planning across maybe 40 plus universities or in other parts of Latin America, China, Poland, you name it, all just fell apart, right, because of COVID. And I picked up a book. It's called The Rumor It Happened. It's written by John Bolton. And it highlights, John Bolton obviously is Trump's security advisor during the first administration. And he talks about in the book, a chapter is called Hanoi, in reference to the Hanoi Peace Summit between Kim Jong-un and Trump. And there he talks about why the peace talks failed between the two leaders, right? And it goes ultimately back to sort of my interest and curiosity, not only in the diaspora, but in our relationship with both Koreas, right? North and South. In the book, John Bolton basically says the peace talks failed because of Trump's impulsive decision, Pompeo, the State Department heads, his sort of political aspirations, and Bolton's sort of ideological difference. That's why the peace talk failed in Korea. And when I was reading those lines, I was thinking, the fate of an entire country hinges upon the decision of three old white men, right? And so I thought to myself, what if one of those members were Korean American, or they had an aide or staffer who had a personal relationship to Korea? Maybe they might have rendered a different decision when it comes to the peace issue here, right? And I'm not approaching peace in any ideological way, but purely pragmatic way as a member of a Korean diaspora. And so I started wondering, maybe if there are more Korean Americans on the Hill or in the White House or in the State Department, maybe, US and North Korea don't have to be too antagonistic towards each other. And that's around when I opened a newspaper one day and saw that there are 5 Korean Americans running for office, right? Highest office after presidency or vice presidency. It's Senate and Congress, right? House of Representatives. And those 5 were running for U.S. House of Representatives. Prior to that, there have been only one Korean American who held that job, right, prior to 2018. So I thought to myself, maybe they're the solution to the Korean peace, right? And I wanted to test that hypothesis. So I started following the 5 Korean Americans for about 4 months. But one character in particular, in more up close and personal, whose name was David Kim, who represented the 34th District in California, who has a fascinating personal background, right? He identifies as LGBTQ, has a father who's an evangelical fundamental pastor. David Kim thinks that Bernie Sanders sometimes isn't left enough, right? So he's a very socialist, LGBTQ, Korean American, young, 39 years old politician running to be the first Korean gay representative in Koreatown, out of all places in LA. And his father obviously had a completely different political spectrum, right? And so I wanted to highlight that dynamic, but at the same time, I wanted to contrast his candidacy with other more established, you know, successful Korean American leaders who are running in different districts. Yeah.
And you were, I guess the movie had been, or the documentary had been released before the elections happened. Is that right?
Yeah, it opened in 2022.
Just from a practical standpoint of stitching this together with following 5 different politicians, going into it, I imagine you would have thought that it would have been difficult, from the jump. Did it end up being kind of as you expected, or was it even harder? Like, what were some of the lessons making a documentary on 5 different politicians, right before the elections happened? I'm just curious about what that experience was like, and what your expectations were going in.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sensitive topic to begin with.
Yeah.
But and it took a lot of convincing of the other 4 candidates to jump on this project, because I knew David Kim personally because we went to law school during the same time. He was another Korean American lawyer, and I invited him when I was living in New York, working as a lawyer, to be a panelist on talking about the Hollywood entertainment law, because he was specializing in that too. But the other 4 I never met, nor did they know who I was or what my intentions were, right? So I had to pull a lot of strings, right? A lot of nudging, mutual friends contact, and they ultimately, signed on to the project. But I had an imbalance of footage. David Kim is like, come anytime, film me anytime, whatever, doing anything.
Yeah.
Whereas the other were like, and it was at the height of COVID, so, not too many strangers could walk in and out of political office. So we had more like a setup time and date. It's like, you can come on this day and not on that date. So the other 4 candidates combined, I think David had maybe 5 times more of a footage than all the other 4 combined, right? So I think the challenge became how to construct this story without sounding too biased, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I wasn't trying to vilify any characters or to overly prefer a certain candidate over the other. Although I have to mention this, that I felt like the 5 candidates were the microcosm of what Korean American community represented, right? 2 were Republican women living in OC. One was New Jersey, Andy Kim, who now is a U.S. Senator, first ever Korean American. Highly educated, elitist sort of outlook on the world. I have a biracial Korean black woman, Marilyn Strickland, running in Seattle or Tacoma. And there's David Kim, rather coming from the humble background as a pastor's kid. So it's a perfect sort of capturing of what Korean America looks like, right? So for me, testing that hypothesis, why do certain characters support Trump and lean anti-immigrants, even if they're immigrants themselves, whereas the other candidates were a lot more socially progressive, and some are extremely Christian fundamental level. How do we bridge gap, right? And how to internalize those differences? Can we still coexist as same people, right? How do you interpret events like LA riots when it impacted both Republicans and Democrats, right? Or Asian American hate crime during COVID, right? So I think testing those hypotheses was a lot of fun. I think the outcome came out to be okay because just judging by the reaction of people who watched the film, they said, oh, it was pretty well balanced after all. Yeah.
I wish I could have watched it, but I couldn't find it.
Yeah,
What's the reason it's just not streaming right now?
Well, so it does stream in Korea on YouTube. You can do a pay-per-view. You can pay just $1,000. And YouTube and Wadis and some other Korean platforms carry it.
Yep.
Netflix never happened. We wanted to get it on Netflix, and it just never happened. So I think that's basically the nature of Korean. Any independent scene is very difficult to get our films on any platforms, right? But you can still watch it on YouTube.
Is that dynamic changing at all, or is it still? Because I mean, from like a funding standpoint, I'm sure if you decided to pursue certain documentaries, people would throw money and funding, and it would be a lot easier to get distribution. You've crowdfunded like the last two, both Geronimo and Chosen.
Yes.
In terms of like the viability of the model that you're using right now, I mean, I assume you're doing it because it gives you like full independent, like creative exercise over everything that you produce. But have you thought about trying other methods at all?
Sure. Now I'm much more open to it. Until the second film, I felt like I could pull it off, right? But you're right. I think certain films do get outsized budget and attention and sort of support, but they generally tend to be political films, highlighting the agenda of a certain side of political spectrum. But other more neutral, value-neutral films like Jeronimo or Chosen, I guess it's safe to say, it's been relatively easy to crowdfund, but making any profit off of it has been extremely challenging. And I'm serious. I meet a lot of documentary filmmakers, both in Korea and the US. I've never met anyone who made a lot of profit off of their film. I think that's just the nature of it, unfortunately. But it's okay. I don't do it for money. And so I picked up a second job these days. I work at my in-laws who... The company that creates sort of ceramic balls that creates alkalinity and high pH level water and also antioxidant, right? Like hydrogen water out of purified water, right? So he's been doing that for a number of years. So I thought it's a good way to sort of balance my creative side along with my sort of more like an in-law, proper son-in-law kind of side. So it's been working out.
Out of curiosity, those metallic balls that you had described, so you drop them into just like a cup of water, or like how does that work?
Right. So generally they sell in a filter form, right? So if you know anything about the water purification system, there's generally a carbon filter that and reverse osmosis that cleans all the contaminants, right? But the outcome, right, the byproduct of those systems is that you get a clean water without proper and enough nutrients in the water, right? Like the minerals, calcium, magnesium, and it's also free of alkalinity and or like antioxidant effects. So what these filter does is that it's at the last stage of this purification system. It sort of mineralizes a purified water, right? It turns into like a healthier water. And so we also sell in like a tea bag, so that it doesn't have to be like an entire purification system. It's primarily a B2B company, so we work with a lot of purification companies, but individual consumers, they can like purchase in a jug, right, pitcher, water pitcher, like Brita system, or like a tea bag. You can drop it in a water bottle and use for like a month.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
We've only got like 5 more minutes. I wish we had more time, but in terms of like questions that I wanted to ask you to wrap up, a question that I sometimes get asked that I'm not always sure how to answer is like companies or individuals have like kind of mission statements or like kind of broader overarching life goals. And when you describe yourself as like a cause-driven type of person, I'm curious in terms of the work that you've done related to Korean diaspora and the documentaries that you've produced. If you have some sort of like overarching life goal or some sort of objective that you hope to see like manifest in the world.
You know, I think around, I look around the Korean politics, US politics, and I think it's pretty troublesome, to say the least. And I wonder what's causing this type of social turmoil. And I begin to think that, and I'll elaborate this during the presentation that I'm going to have next week, is I used to think being a diaspora was just a noun. Right, it refers to a group of people who live outside of their homeland. Right, that's the traditional textbook definition. But I met a philosopher maybe 5 years ago who watched Geronimo, and we were having conversation like this after a movie, and he said, "Joseph, I'm afraid to say that your definition of diaspora is quite limiting, right, and limited." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And he says, your definition is very geographical and very political and social, right? And so I said, please go on and elaborate. And he said, for me, being a diaspora is not a noun, but a verb, right? So I try to be diasporic. I try to think diasporically. And that means I try to see the world in two different perspectives. One from the dominant sort of narrative, and another from the periphery, just as how diaspora would see the world. And he also says, whenever I feel comfortable, I try to run to the margins, right? Whenever I feel like I'm part of the mainstream, I try to be a minority, right? To me, diaspora, he goes on to say, is a philosophical and existential question, right? Not just a geographical, right? What we truly should strive to be isn't to leave Korea, but to think diasporically, right? I mean, that should be our ultimate goal, right? And so I started sort of deliberating on what it means to consciously live diasporically, and that's been a challenge. And so whenever I try to tell a story, I don't just try to focus on people living outside of somewhere, but if they're living diasporically. And that's my sort of mission statement.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, even with what I've started with Cambridge, I mean, originally I thought, I'm an English-speaking person living in Korea that doesn't speak Korean. I just want to find other people that I can have interesting conversations with to hopefully like better understand the culture and the country. But more and more I find interesting people that are kind of reconfiguring my own understanding of identity, because it is such a peculiar thing.
Of course.
And you're definitely one of them. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentation next week and all collaboration opportunities that exist in the future. So thank you for doing the podcast.
No, awesome. Tiger, I want to, give you credit for just acting out your curiosity and just really testing your own hypothesis to bring people together both digitally and offline. And I think I certainly saw the need, right? When 70 people from all different walks of life come into a same room, I'm like, he's tapping into something that has great potential. So I want to try to support you as much as I can, and kudos to you.
Thank you, Joseph. Appreciate it.